This is Live Fire, with the latest news about threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. Remember, the issue is not just about gun control. It's about control. Now, here's your host, Larry Pratt.
Welcome to this edition of Live Fire on the Gun Owners News Hour. I want to talk about something that violates the politically correct norms of our country today. We're going to talk about politics and religion. Oof, can you imagine? I've just finished reading a really magnificent book, brought tears to my eyes on occasion. Bring Back the Black-Robed Regiment. And that is a reference to the extraordinary pastors of our war for independence. They didn't just preach sticking it to the tyrants from Britain. In many cases, they led the fight themselves. These were not sunshine soldiers. Some of them stayed in the war the duration. Extraordinary men, and frankly, their families too. I don't know how they made it, because there wasn't any Social Security to take care of them, for sure. Anyway, the author is a state rep and a pastor himself, violating our national taboo, and I'm glad you are, Dan. Dan Fisher is in the Oklahoma House of Representatives, and he sure is in a pulpit every Sunday, and sometimes other days as well. So welcome aboard. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Larry. It is an honor to be with you.
Well, it's my honor to have you, my friend. You've really done a wonderful job with this book. I think there couldn't be any doubt, if somebody would simply read this book, that our country was based on a fusion of politics and Christian religion. It's what animated not only the preachers, but the soldiers themselves. One of the statements in your book that springs to mind is the preachers were better recruiters for the Army than were the recruiters.
No, you're exactly right. In fact, when these Army recruiters would go into one of these towns to recruit men for the Continental Army, they would often find one of these preachers and get him to actually do the recruiting, and of course thus spurs the statement they were better recruiters than the recruiters. These preachers understood what was at stake. They knew that if liberty was lost, then their liberty to believe what they held dear would go along with it. So they understood.
And by the way, that belief that you just put your finger on also was what created the American tradition of toleration of other people and their different beliefs.
Exactly. These preachers were not trying to establish some theocracy. They didn't want that. In fact, England had that with the Anglican Church, where the king was not only the head of the state, he was the head of the church. They didn't want that. But what they did want was the liberty to believe whatever they believed and embrace it, and that's what they were fighting for.
I've had on my wall, I'm looking at it right now, for years, a reproduction of probably a pretty well-known painting of Reverend Peter Muhlenberg from my state out in the Shenandoah Valley, in the act of taking off his clerical gown and revealing the uniform of a colonel in the Continental Army, in which he served until Yorktown. What an incredible guy.
In fact, I dedicated the second chapter in my book to him. And this guy led those forces from 76 to 83. And like you said, he was there at Yorktown. In fact, was promoted to Major General status and led the final attack on Redoubt 10 there in Yorktown that opened the way for the Americans to force the surrender of Cornwallis. Just a phenomenal guy. And on top of it, he revitalized the sagging troops in Virginia, because, as you know, Virginia was war-torn like it was even in the war between the states, and the forces were just almost down to nothing because they had bled them dry to go fight in the other colonies, and the British were going to try to use Virginia as the doorway, kind of a back door into the colonies, and it was Muhlenberg that Washington sent back to Virginia with no supplies, no resources, and said, do whatever you can do, the war will be won or lost in Virginia. And doggone it, if he didn't pull those troops back together, and even ran Benedict Arnold. Arnold led a force trying to backdoor it through Virginia, and he was able to stave him off and turn him back.
A truly amazing guy. And now I knew about generally what we're talking about, that Peter Muhlenberg left his pulpit and went to battle and actually led in battle.
Yes.
But what I didn't know so much, I knew that there were a lot of Patriot preachers. That much I was up on. But that so many of them not only preached on Sunday, but then they led men that afternoon.
Oh, that's true. That's true. You know, the book that I've written that you were referring to is my first stab at this. It's more of a textbook, and it's probably deeper than what a lot of people want to go. And so I'm working on a condensed version, but I wanted to get their story out there because it's locked away today in all these little records and books that were written before the war between the states, and it's just impossible to find any lengthy definitive work. And see, that's the point. Most of these guys were involved. It was just phenomenal, and many times their churches, the men in their churches were willing to go fight, but they wouldn't go unless their pastor led them. And so their pastors became fighting chaplains and were the commanders of these little regiments out of their own churches.
That was so impressive to me that it almost chokes me up at this moment to think that these guys would put it all out. They didn't just talk the talk, they walked it.
Oh, they did. I don't know if you were able to read the story of John Rossbrew, but Rossbrew was from the wilderness of New Jersey at that time. And he was,
wonder where that was.
But see, he was 63 when the war started, and that's just a little bit too old to go marching off to war, but he encouraged the men of his church to go. But when Washington and the troops were steamrolled at the Battle of Long Island, New York, he called his men of his congregation together and said, we've got to rally to Washington's aid. And his men said, we'll go under one condition, you lead us. And this 63-year-old man leaves his family and his church and leads the men of his congregation off to fight. And they fought at the Battle of Trenton, and he was actually murdered. I would call it murdered rather than killed at the Second Battle of Trenton a week later when the British tried to retake Trenton after Washington had taken it from the Hessians back 7 days before. These men were willing to die, and the British so hated these guys, if they captured them on the battlefield, many times they would execute them right on the spot. And even while they were trying to surrender, Rossbrew was trying to surrender, and they killed him. Or they'd put him on a prison ship, which was just a terrible, terrible experience. It
would be better to be shot than to be put on a prison ship, because
no, you're right.
You described what happened to one of the chaps on that ship, and it's a slow death.
Allen. Yeah, Moses Allen.
Just a slow death. You know you're going to get sick. They didn't care about sanitation.
Oh, no.
And, when summertime came along, that was your prime victim time. And I guess, what did you say, something like 11,000 men died on prison ships?
11,500, and the highest death rate was among the preachers.
Well, wow. Talking with Dan Fisher, a pastor, a state legislator, and for right now, most importantly, the author of Bringing Back the Black Robe Regiment. And I certainly hope that we can bring it back indeed. I hope the book will inspire preachers right now to put on that black robe. We're talking about politics and religion right now, all in one brew. My guest is Reverend and State Representative in Oklahoma, Dan Fisher. He's the author of Bringing Back the Black Robed Regiment, and it's a call for preachers who will fight. Now, today, we don't really probably need them to grab an AK-47, although that wouldn't be a bad idea just to limber it up a little bit. But there are things to fight about, like abortion and what the government was doing to Cliven Bundy out in Nevada. Yes. There's all kinds of excessive government wickedness that needs to be addressed. And who better to lay down the foundation than preachers, because that's exactly what they did, as you show in your book, Dan. Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, they were preaching, of course, how one comes to know Jesus Christ, but they were also preaching, now that you know Jesus Christ, what about us taking control of our government and imposing a biblical structure on it? Not a theocracy, as you've said, but there are things that government is to do and are not to do, and that's what the minister can teach about.
Well, that's right. You know, if you consider James Caldwell, he was the Presbyterian preacher in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. He was preaching this stuff so strongly that the British put a bounty out on him. So he would walk into his pulpit every Sunday wearing 2 loaded flintlock pistols. And, of course, the men of his church were armed, and he would pull those pistols out, put them on the pulpit, and preach, then stick them back in his belt and walk to the doors and greet his congregation as they left.
Well, he's leading by example.
He was. He was. And when the British invaded Elizabethtown, New Jersey, a redcoat literally murdered his wife. She was with the children, and he shot her through the window.
That, I thought, was one of the more dreadful examples of the cruelty of the British, too often of the British troops.
Oh, yeah. Well, the county where he lived at that time, their county seal is of that moment when a British soldier is shooting her through the window. I mean, that's still the artwork that county uses. Well, he helped do her funeral. Then he went on to Springfield where his men were fighting with the British, and he's the one that got the Isaac Watts hymnals because the men had run out of wadding for their guns, and is telling them to use the Isaac Watts hymns, rip them out of the hymn book to be able to use their flintlocks. And so he's yelling, "Give them Watts, boys, put Watts into them," while they're fighting the British.
You know, George III knew what was going on. He and other Brits referred to, you said it was Horace Walpole, a writer, who said, well, it looks as if America has run off with her Presbyterian pastor. And so
right.
It made me kind of happy to be a Presbyterian, something I can't always say I'm happy about. But that was one good report, and I'm sorry we've kind of slid downhill from that high point. But maybe we can get back on our horse and start leading again from the front.
I hope so. I hope so. Well, you know, the historian George Bancroft, he said that as far as the Revolution of 1776 was affected by religion, it was a Presbyterian measure. So you Presbyterians have a high bar to live up to.
Well, and I don't want to see it lowered. It was interesting that even while today what we're talking about probably is a news flash to some of our listeners, but it was still apparently fairly well known even in the mid-19th century. I wrote down what you had presented from a British periodical, the Bibliotheca Sacra, in 1856. If Christian ministers had not preached and prayed, there might have been no revolution as yet. Or had it broken out, it might have been crushed. And you had provided many like statements where people were quite aware that had these preachers, not all of them obviously, but a goodly number of them, preached the way they did and led the way they did, we would still be the united colonies of the British Empire.
Well, you're exactly right, Larry. In fact, their title, Black-Robed Regiment, was given to them by the British. Peter Oliver, who was a Tory, was the one who pinned that name on them because they understood that it was the preachers who were kind of the impetus to this thing, and that's why they were so harsh with them when they would catch them on the battlefield. They blamed the thing on the preachers. So there's no question that they were the leaders in the effort.
Well, it was really an amazing time, and for me to learn that they were not just running their mouth, but they were also running their trigger fingers. I thought that's pretty impressive.
Do you remember the story of Thomas Allen in the book? His brother was Moses that tried to jump off one of those prison ships and drowned because he was so weakened from having been on the ship. Well, Thomas Allen was the man who led his troops out onto the field to fight at the Battle of Bennington, Vermont, and he wore his preaching rig to lead his men out to fight.
Talk about making yourself a target.
That's right. And then he walks out in front of his men toward the British and jumps up on a stump and gives the British the opportunity to surrender before his men are given the order to open fire. And they shoot at him and miss him, and he goes back and he fights all day long beside his brother Joe. And a few days after the battle, one of the men from his church says, "Preacher, I heard that you fought like a common soldier the other day. Did you kill anybody?" And that's when he said, "Well, I don't know if I killed anybody, but I noticed behind a bush there was a flash, and every time it would flash, one of our men would fall. So I took steady aim at the bush and I fired. I don't know if I killed anybody, but I put out that flash." And see, that was Preacher Thomas Allen.
And I guess it was a hot enough fight that he didn't really have that much curiosity. The problem went away. That's all we need to deal with right now.
That's exactly right.
I just caught a note that I'd made about this guy Roseborough, who had, if I remember correctly, he had fought in the old country, then he came over here, got in the fight again. He was always fighting tyrants, and when they're about to murder him, he'd been captured and had surrendered. He asked to say a prayer before they murdered him,
Yes.
And he prayed for their forgiveness.
He did. He certainly did. He asked the Lord not to lay his death to their charge.
Of course, that doesn't save them from much, because they probably had committed a few other sins. They better have made their peace with Jesus.
Well, that's right. Well, and they bayoneted him to death with such fury that when his body was found later by another black-robed preacher named George Duffield out of Philadelphia, one of the bayonets was broken off in Ross Brew's body.
What violence.
That's how violent. And so the preacher Duffield, with the help of some others, gave him a decent burial there in Trenton, where his monument is today.
It was very stirring that immigrants who had come to this country for freedom were willing to fight for it, too.
Yes.
It just opened a new world to me to see what kind of a spirit there was among so many of our predecessors. Obviously, they weren't all of the same mind. There were Tories and people that actually fought with the British soldiers. But that was not the prevailing spirit.
Oh, no. No, and I'll tell you, these preachers were the moral voice. But it's like you said a while ago, they were willing to put their money where their mouths were, and they picked up flintlocks. I give little vignettes, as you know, in the book, just little one-paragraph deals on so many of these guys. But like John Treadwell, he kept a loaded flintlock in his pulpit and would carry a Bible and a cartridge box up there to preach on Sundays.
Boy, a man after my own heart. You're talking about the original bitter clinger, clinging to his gun and his Bible. We're talking today about how you mix politics and religion. You do it the way our founding fathers did it. And it's called, in a book, Bringing Back the Black-Robed Regiment, a call for preachers who will fight. Dan Fisher, my guest, is an Oklahoma State rep and a pastor in that state. And I was looking at my notes about this guy Mullenberg, whose picture, a reproduction of a drawing, I guess. It's on my wall. He not only preached, and he not only put that uniform on and fought with Washington right through the war, but as my notes remind me, he had this incredible penchant for putting himself in the most dangerous place of every battle that they were in. And even if guys were thinking about fleeing, looking at their colonel or at some point general leading in such a fashion, you couldn't turn and run. Guys like that.
Well, General Anthony Wayne was the same way, and many of his troops called him Mad Anthony. But even General Wayne commented on the bravery of Peter Muhlenberg, because he would just get into the thick of it. He didn't lead from the rear, because you can't do that.
No.
He got right out in the middle.
Our president has proven that quite well.
Well, that's right. You are exactly. He's a case study, isn't he?
Well, my. He would not have been anywhere near that battlefield. No. Although, interestingly, there were, as you pointed out, some perhaps a quarter of the troops at the Battle of Yorktown were blacks?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. See, that's the thing that a lot of people don't realize. In fact, in I believe it's Chapter 8, I give about 7 little 2 to 5 page biographies of some of these guys that we know a little bit more about. And the final one is of a black preacher named Lemuel Haynes. Now, he was not a pastor then. It was a little more difficult for a black man to be a pastor. Later on, he did pastor, but he was a preacher, and he was a spy. He actually did dual service. He served Cornwallis and then would slip away at night and take the information back to Washington. And he served in the American Army. Just pieces of our history, Larry, that we've not been told.
It's such marvelous examples, such stellar character, and what they were able to accomplish is just stunning, because, as you point out in the book, when the decision was made to stand and fight on Lexington Green, not to initiate, but to make absolutely certain it was clear who started the conflict, they really had nothing. They might have their flintlock, sure, but they didn't have a large supply of powder. They didn't have a large supply of ball. They didn't have uniforms. Probably a lot of them didn't even have a sword, probably had a knife, but they were a ragtag bunch, many of them all the way through.
Oh, yeah. They were farmers, merchants, blacksmiths. In fact, one of the guys in Jonas Clark's Minutemen there in Lexington was killed going into the church for more ammunition. because they were keeping the ammunition in Clark's church, which was also the community, what we'd call the community building.
That was Captain Parker that was killed then?
No, it was a different one of the Minutemen himself.
Okay.
But see, because there were 8 of them killed at that skirmish battle, whatever you want to call it, and then another 10 of them were wounded. But see, that's the thing that a lot of people don't know. And Larry, a few years ago when I found out that the Lexington Minutemen, I mean the famous Lexington Minutemen, were trained and led by a preacher and a deacon, and the deacon's name was John Parker.
There he is.
Yeah, he was a veteran of the French and Indian War, and then the preacher's name was Jonas Clark. He was the pastor of the church in Lexington, and today, John Parker's statue, which is the famous Minuteman statue, stands about where Clark's church sat, in the days of the battle. And it was Jonas Clark, the pastor's house, that Paul Revere rode up to on his famous midnight ride, because Samuel Adams and John Hancock were spending the night with Pastor Clark. John Hancock's father had pastored that church, grandfather had pastored it years before. And, I mean, all of these pieces revolve around the church in those days.
That is so striking that, let's see, another quote to kind of drive that point in. You pulled one out from an historian by the name of James Adams.
Yes.
Who said that freedom was not born a bastard. Freedom was birthed when church and state were still married.
Yes.
I love it.
Isn't that good? Yeah. Well, there's another author that I quote from often. His name was John Wingate Thornton, and he was one of these historians about the time of the war between the states. He wrote in 1860, and one of the comments that he makes, and the quote's there in the book, that the fathers of the Republic did not divorce politics and religion, but they considered the separation as ungodly.
Mine. So totally opposite of our...
Complete opposite. We've turned it completely on its head, and we teach the exact opposite today.
And we get the kind of political culture that we have now.
That's exactly right.
The kind of political corruption that we're so used to, I believe, would have been unthinkable when they saw whiffs of it emanating from London and other British locations here in the United States. That's when they decided it was time to get moving.
Well, that's right. They had exhausted every option they thought was available to them. And, of course, Jefferson and the other members of the Committee of Five make that point in the Declaration at the very end when they list those grievances that they just could not get satisfaction with the Parliament or the King. And, in fact, there was going to be one extra grievance, and the Committee of Five, and I believe it was a mistake, but they didn't think they could keep the southern colonies in if they kept it. But the extra grievance was the fact that the King of England would not allow the colonies to abolish slavery.
Was very new information to me.
When I was doing the research on this, Larry, you could have knocked me over with a feather. I didn't know that was removed from the Declaration before it was finalized because they didn't want to alienate the southern colonies. But that was one of their grievances. See, if kids were taught this stuff in school, forget about that you have to emphasize the Christian nature of it. Just if they were taught these things, they would come away with a whole different view than what they get.
That generation operated on the basis of a proverb, a biblical proverb: when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people mourn. Well, It's been kind of mournful for quite some time in our country.
Hasn't it?
And yet, at the turn of the last century, or around that time, a guy who had been an evangelist, which I had no idea about, a Northern general, became the President of the United States, James Garfield.
James Garfield was an evangelist. That's exactly right.
I met a guy, the President of Guatemala, who was an unofficial, unordained evangelist, Rios Montt, brought in by a coup. He had been a general. They respected him, and they kind of made him the head of the government, or he was allowed to make himself the head of the three-man junta. And he would give a sermon every Sunday night on a national broadcast, and when I was there gathering information, I wrote a little book about it. A lot of people thought that one of the main motives that the colonels had for overthrowing him after a year and a half, by the way, during which time he had pacified the communist insurgency.
Right.
Nobody else had been able to do. They think that it was all that preaching that irritated him, and it was associated with his refusal to tolerate corruption. And the habit in Guatemala had been that every group of colonels had a year that they graduated. It was like an anniversary, and when a certain anniversary occurred, that was going to be their last year, and the practice had been that that's when you stole all you could put in your pockets. And Riosmont wasn't letting that happen, and by golly, we're not going to let that continue. And so he was just too darn good. But James Garfield happily didn't get thrown out, and but he didn't last that long because somebody put a bullet in him.
Yeah, that's true.
I tell you what, it's tough business. I'm Larry Pratt of Gun Owners of America, and I want to invite you to join the Second Amendment movement with Gun Owners of America, the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. Take action by becoming a GOA member today by going to gunowners.org. Gun Owners members receive the GOA newsletter, fact sheets, alerts, certificates, and more. But there's more to joining GOA than just a list of member benefits. The united voice of GOA members has been successful in defeating restrictive legislation designed to disarm our population. GOA has helped to get strong constitutional members of Congress like Senator Ted Cruz elected. And with your help, GOA will continue to successfully defend the rights of gun owners in the courts. Participate in our efforts to restore and preserve the nation's right to keep and bear arms. All contributions to our lobbying efforts are used exclusively to support or oppose firearms legislation. Join online at gunowners.org. And there are enough examples in the book to make a pretty convincing argument that the one thing that there was rather a consensus about at the time of our War for Independence was politics and religion can't be separated, that it would be unbiblical. Now, there were Tories that had another view of government, but they, too, had biblical arguments for their position.
Right.
So
that's right.
This was a debate between pulpits that erupted finally, or spilled over into battlefields. But the pulpits were, as you pointed out, where the first shots were fired, and it was only poetic justice, I guess, that literally the Battle of Lexington erupted in front of a church that had been preaching it all those many, many years. This was not something that just developed over the last year or two of final irritation. This was something that the colonists had been preaching when the oppression was rather benign, say 20, 30 years before, but they began to realize that a power so distant couldn't possibly make correct decisions, even if they were trying to be benign. And it was pretty obvious that they weren't trying to be benign. And so things got more and more difficult. But anyway, another thing that I learned, I hadn't had any idea. I knew about Charles Finney, great evangelist. Many, many, many people made professions of faith under his ministry. But that he was a guy who argued early and often that politics and religion can't be separated.
He did. In fact, a quote that I use, and if I could just give a shameless plug, I have a website called theblackrobed, ROBED.com.
Oh, good.
Where people can go to get the book, to find out other things. But I go around doing a presentation of the history of these guys. It's about a 45-minute presentation. I do it in period costume, and I reenact the Muhlenberg moment where he pulls off his robe. And I give the highlights of some of the things you and I have been talking about. I carry with me a 30-piece traveling museum. I have muskets. I have one musket that crossed the Delaware River, carried by Private Isaac Cook, and was used at the Battle of Trenton.
Whoa.
I have another musket that was used by Lieutenant William Perkins at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And the people get to see these and hold them. So they get to hold their history, not just hear about it.
It's like connecting with our past.
Yes, sir. And if they would ever be interested in my coming to their area and doing one of these presentations, one of the larger churches can host me, or maybe a number of smaller ones can come together and do kind of a cooperative effort and have me on a Sunday evening. Man, we travel and love to do this to reacquaint, because it's one thing to talk about it, but boy, to see it in action is, just spurs the people on. So I wanted to kind of throw that in before we wrapped up. But when you were talking about Finney, I use a quote in my presentation where 5 times he mentions that if things are falling apart in the country, he says over and over, the pulpit is responsible for it. Just over and over and over, the pulpit, the pulpit, the pulpit. Yeah, and then he even closes. Let me just give you this little piece of a quote here at the end of this section. He says, Christians seem to act as if they think God does not see what they do in politics. But I tell you, he does see it, and he will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take.
Well, that always seemed to me to be the case, and I'm just glad to realize how fully this was appreciated when our country was founded. And I'm glad that you went and pointed to some of the biblical examples where believers were engaging politicians. When Paul was standing before Agrippa, the king, and governors Felix and Festus, Caesar himself. Paul, I think, looked forward to those occasions. He wanted to. There was another opportunity to evangelize.
Well, there's no question. In fact, he ended up in Rome, chained to house guard, winning many of those guards to Christ because he requested to see Caesar. And the whole point was he was exercising his Roman citizenship and using it to get the gospel out and to defend truth.
Yeah, it was just really quite a moment, and hopefully folks will ponder that and not be convinced by the spirit of our age, but by the actual history, which is in bringing back the Black-Robed Regiment. And let's repeat that website. It's blackrobed.com.
Yes.
And that's where you can get all kinds of information to ammunition, as it were, to fight this intellectual battle that is part of what we need to be doing. I like this point that you got from Samuel West. I think, if I remember, he was a preacher.
Yeah.
As soon as a magistrate becomes a tyrant, he forfeits his authority to govern and becomes the minister of Satan. Now, that's about as strong as you can put it.
Well, it is.
I agree with it, too.
And see, that's in his exposition of Romans 13. Romans chapter 13 basically gives Paul's view of government, that it's an institution of God, and that their job is to protect the doers of good and to punish the doers of evil. Well, the founders believed that if government ceases to do its job and does the opposite, rewards the doers of evil and punishes the doers of good, they've abdicated their right, and thus the people have the right, even as the Declaration of Independence says, to throw off that government and to replace it with the kind of government that will protect what is good. And that was the whole concept that they worked under.
And it all stems really from the character of the people, and if they're not hearing it from the pulpit, as you said, then all bets are off. The passage many Christians, I think, are familiar with, 2 Chronicles 7:14. I'm glad you make the argument. That still applies. Yeah, that's in the Old Testament. But where did we find an expiration date on that? That if my people who are called by my name will confess their sin and turn to me, then I will forgive them and heal the land. That's a pretty close quote. And
well, you're very close.
That is very encouraging to me because, but in a way, it's a big challenge because if my people, if we don't, then we're just going to keep rocking along the same road we're on right now.
Well, and you know, Larry, the key to that is God's people. Now, that was written to Israel, but the principle would apply. If the believers in America, the Christians, if the church would stand up, repent, and begin to speak out, I have every confidence that God would work in our favor to reverse some of this nonsense that's going on. I was talking to General Jerry Boykin one day, and I said, Jerry, we have the Army. The Christian Army is the largest group that meets on a weekly basis in America. There are millions of us. We have the Army. He said, yes, Dan, but we have no generals to lead it. And that's the reason why I'm trying so hard to awaken pastors to their history, to their heritage, and Christian leaders and just Christians in general, not just pastors, because it took everybody. But if the pastors would begin to lead the way, I'm telling you, Larry, everywhere I go, the congregations are ready. They're just looking for field commanders who will lead them.
Well, and a lot of it's going to depend on the kind of language that's used. It has to really call out the evildoers.
Yes.
One thing that caught my eye was you quoted a pastor, John Cleveland, who identified General Gage as a rebel. And I'm sure General Gage was as surprised as a newspaper editor was when I, in a letter to his newspaper, identified President Clinton as a rebel.
Yeah.
And he wrote back and said, what? How can the head of the government be a rebel? That's you guys.
Yeah, right.
Well,
They've usurped the God-given authority that they have, and once you've done that, whether it's a pastor, you take, for instance, a local congregation. If the pastor begins to usurp God's authority and leads people in the opposite direction of Scripture, that church has the right to get rid of him. Well, what's the difference?
Yeah, exactly. We have to be as clear-minded in the pulpit as hopefully they were on the battlefield.
That's right.
Alas, we're running up against the clock, the problem of life. We're born to run out of time. We've been talking about bringing back the Black Robed Regiment. You can find it at blackrobed.com. And hope you'll go there and get this book, get the information that's in it, share it with your pastor.